How does a 10-year-old boy go from a Tennessee trailer park to starring alongside the biggest names in Hollywood, only to die alone at 25, completely erased and ignored by the industry that built him? In 1994, Brad Renfro had no acting training, no industry connections, and no preparation for what was about to happen to his life. What he had was something that Hollywood had been specifically looking for: a raw, unpolished, genuinely rough quality that no drama school could manufacture and no stage parent could produce. The industry found it, put it on screen, and built a career around it. What it never planned for was what happens when the kid it built that career on starts to crack under the weight of it. So, what happened in the years between? And what does Brad Renfro's story say about an industry that treats authenticity as a resource to be mined rather than a person to be protected? To understand that, we have to go back to where Brad Renfro's story actually begins. Brad Renfro was born on July 25, 1982, in Knoxville, Tennessee, and grew up in circumstances that had nothing to do with the entertainment world. He was raised primarily by his grandmother in a trailer park. His parents were not stable presences in his early life, and the household he grew up in did not offer the structured, aspirational environment that typically produces child actors. He was a kid from a hard background, without a particular plan for what his life was going to look like beyond the neighborhood he knew. In 1993, casting director Molly Finn was tasked with finding a very specific kind of child for Joel Schumacher's adaptation of John Grisham's The Client. Not a trained performer, but a genuine, rough-edged boy who actually looked and felt like a child who had grown up without much. Finn contacted agencies that worked with youth across the country and searched through 5,000 boys all over the United States before the trail led to Knoxville. Renfro was brought to her attention by Dennis Bowman, a retired local police officer and DARE program representative who had been captivated by the boy's charm and street smarts. There is an irony in that detail that is difficult to ignore. The officer running an anti-drug awareness program was the one who put a 10-year-old on the path to Hollywood, and that same 10-year-old would never quite escape either world. Renfro had never acted. He had never auditioned. He was simply unmistakably, exactly what the production needed. To understand what that moment meant for Brad Renfro specifically, you have to understand what he was being moved from. He was a 10-year-old boy living with his grandmother, without the financial resources or family stability that most children take for granted. The transition from that environment to a major Hollywood production, a film set, a professional cast, a studio treating him as a collaborator, happened in a matter of months. There was no gradual preparation, no industry infrastructure built around ensuring this child landed safely in the world he was being dropped into. There was a discovery, a performance, and a film. What came next was largely left to chance. The Client was released in 1994. Renfro played Mark Sway, a sharp, streetwise kid who witnesses a mob lawyer's confession and finds himself caught between organized crime and a relentless federal prosecutor. He held his own, not in a precocious, trained child way, but in a manner that genuinely convinced people who knew what a good performance looked like. He had a quality of presence that felt unforced and entirely his own. Susan Sarandon recognized it. Tommy Lee Jones recognized it. The film was a significant commercial success, and virtually every review that mentioned the young lead expressed genuine surprise at the performance he had delivered. In 1995, The Hollywood Reporter named him a Young Star Award winner. He was 12 years old. He had moved from a Tennessee trailer park to award recognition in less than 2 years, and the industry was certain it had found something extraordinary. What nobody around him appeared to be particularly focused on was what that transition, that speed, that exposure, that sudden and total immersion in a professional world he had no preparation for, was going to cost a child who had already started life without much of a foundation to stand on. Here is the thing about Brad Renfro's career that needs to be stated plainly. From the first role to the last, he was consistently cast as the troubled kid. That was not coincidence. It was a casting logic built on a fundamental recognition that he was not playing those characters from the outside in. Directors returned to him repeatedly because what he brought to dark and morally complicated material was not technique. It was familiarity. He knew, at a level that careful training rarely replicates, what it felt like to be a kid whose world was not stable. That showed up on screen. The industry understood this, even if it never said so directly. The result was a career built almost entirely on accessing something real in Brad Renfro, rather than developing something professional. After The Client, the roles kept coming. The Cure in 1995, Tom and Huck in 1995. Then Sleepers in 1996, Barry Levinson's acclaimed drama about abuse, survival, and revenge in a New York reformatory, featuring Brad Pitt and Robert De Niro. Renfro held his own in that company in the way that only a specific kind of performer can. Not by overpowering the scene, but by belonging in it entirely. And then came Apt Pupil in 1998, directed by Bryan Singer and based on Stephen King's novella, where Renfro played Todd Bowden, a high-achieving teenager who discovers that his neighbor is a former Nazi war criminal and becomes consumed by drawing out his darkest histories. Opposite Ian McKellen in a film built on sustained and deeply uncomfortable psychological tension, Renfro was credible in a way that surprised people who might have expected a former child star to falter in that company. The performance earned him the Best Actor award at the Tokyo International Film Festival and a Saturn Award nomination. He was not just a child star coasting on likability. He was, when the material demanded it, a genuinely capable actor. That is worth saying clearly, because the way his story tends to be told often reduces him to his struggles rather than accounting for what he was actually delivering on screen. But here is what was also happening during these years. While Renfro was delivering performances that critics recognized and directors sought, the infrastructure around him was not keeping pace with his career. He had no stable home environment, no meaningful adult framework built by the industry that was profiting from his work, and no real buffer between the difficult circumstances he had grown up in and the specific pressures of a Hollywood career that had started when he was too young to understand what any of it meant. The industry was drawing on something biographical in him, something real and personal, and investing nothing in the person who was supplying it. That dynamic, extract the rawness, ignore the source of it, is not unique to Renfro's story. But it is rarely as clearly illustrated as it is here, in a career where every significant role he played was built on accessing the specific weight of a childhood that nobody around him had done anything to alleviate. By his late teens, his struggles with substance use were becoming a matter of public record. In June 1998, he was arrested near Knoxville on drug possession charges, carrying cocaine in a cigarette box and marijuana in his sock. In August 2000, he was in Fort Lauderdale, preparing to film Larry Clark's Bully, when he climbed out of his motel room window, got drunk, and attempted to steal a 45-foot yacht from the harbor, hot-wiring the vessel, but forgetting to untie it, so it crashed back into the dock. Clark bailed him out of jail and took him straight to set, where Renfro had a scene to shoot and delivered it. Rehab stays followed. Legal proceedings followed. The same tabloid apparatus that had covered his discovery and his early success now documented his deterioration with the same appetite, just a different register. The industry that had celebrated his rough edges when they sold tickets had a very different relationship with them now that they were generating a different kind of headline. The work became more sporadic and further from the mainstream. Larry Clark's Bully in 2001 gave him one of his most demanding and unguarded roles, and he delivered. Critics who engaged with the film recognized a genuine performance rather than a diminished one. But the mainstream trajectory had permanently shifted. He was no longer the fresh discovery with the compelling edge. He was the troubled former child star, and Hollywood has very specific and very practiced ideas about what to do with those. The industry does not invest in troubled former child stars. It does not develop them, rehabilitate them, or build new frameworks around them. It moves on and finds the next child who has what it needs. The pattern is not a failure of individual judgment. It is the system operating exactly as it was built to operate. By his mid-20s, the Hollywood career that had launched with such speed and genuine early promise had contracted to the margins. He was still working, smaller projects, independent productions, the edges of an industry he had once occupied a more central position in. He had continued to show up, continued to work, continued to fight for whatever version of the career he could still access. That matters because it complicates any easy narrative about a child star who simply burned out and stopped trying. He also had a son, Yamato Renfro, born in 2003 in Japan, whose existence he had kept entirely private. In the weeks before everything unraveled, he had visited Yamato and told his cousin Jesse that he wanted to marry the boy's mother and build something real, that he had hit rock bottom and come way back up. He was still fighting the addiction that had been public knowledge for nearly a decade, living in Los Angeles, the city that had made him briefly famous at 10 years old and had largely stopped thinking about him before he turned 23, navigating a life that the industry which put him there had never equipped him to manage. However, for Brad Renfro, the road back would come too late. On January 15, 2008, Brad Renfro was found lifeless in his Los Angeles apartment. He was only 25 years old. The Los Angeles County coroner determined the cause to be acute heroin and morphine intoxication. Accidental, with no foul play. The Informers, his final film, was still in post-production. It would be released later that year without him. His career had not reached any formal ending or resolution. It simply stopped. He was 25 years old, which meant he had spent more than half his life inside a Hollywood industry that had never built anything around him designed to last. The news of Brad Renfro's death generated the kind of coverage that a former child star with a troubled public record generates in the entertainment press. Brief articles, short tributes, the language of professional condolence deployed at a careful distance. And then, 7 days later, on January 22, 2008, Heath Ledger was found lifeless in his Manhattan apartment. Ledger was 28, had just completed his performance as the Joker in The Dark Knight, and was by every measure at the center of his industry's most serious attention. His death was global news. The coverage was immediate, sustained, and overwhelming in a way that few events in entertainment journalism ever are. Everything written about Brad Renfro in the preceding week was buried beneath it. This is not a criticism of the grief for Ledger, which was genuine, or of the recognition of his work, which was warranted and real. But the contrast between how the two losses were absorbed by the industry reveals something specific about how Hollywood values the people who have worked within it, not equally, not consistently, and not simply according to the quality of the work they produced. On February 1st, 2008, 17 days after Brad's death, his grandmother Joanne, who had accompanied him regularly throughout his early acting career and had been the one stable figure in his life from childhood, passed away at her home at the age of 76. The woman who had been there at the very beginning outlived him by just over 2 weeks. The detail that made the industry's attitude toward Brad Renfro most explicit came at the 2008 Academy Awards ceremony. The annual In Memoriam segment acknowledges members of the film community who passed during the preceding year. Heath Ledger was included. Brad Renfro was not. When the omission drew widespread public attention, Academy spokeswoman Leslie Unger responded, "Unfortunately, we cannot include everyone." It also emerged that Renfro had never been an invited member of the Academy, and that membership was, by the spokesperson's own admission, one of the considerations taken into account. He had appeared in multiple studio films, worked with directors of genuine reputation, and delivered performances across more than a decade that critics had recognized and documented. The industry had been finished with him long before January 15, 2008. The In Memoriam decision simply confirmed it on the official record. Hollywood has always called what it found in actors like Brad Renfro authenticity. What that word means, in practice, is real experience that cannot be faked, pain, instability, and damage that registers on screen in ways that careful training rarely replicates. The industry mines that quality, packages it, sells it, and moves on. It does not ask what it costs the 10-year-old supplying it. Brad Renfro supplied it for 15 years. Somewhere in Japan, his son is in his 20s now, a person the public didn't know existed until after his father was gone. So here is the question his story leaves behind. If Hollywood builds careers on the weight of what a child has actually lived, what exactly is its obligation to that child when the weight becomes too much to carry? Let me know your thoughts on this story in the comments. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.